Right, so last class I left off by saying that we were going to look primarily at the magician's nephew, and the reason why I wanted to do that is twofold. Firstly, it fits in with what I said last time about the way in which in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Lewis is talking about progressive education, the progressive education that Eustace Scrubb had, and also, what's her name? Draw a blank. Never mind. It comes up later in the Jill in Silver Chair. Same sort of education. And that the company that was on the Dawn Treader, and it's important that it's on a ship because the ship in Christian historical interpretation is a symbol of the church. And so interestingly, this boy, Eustace, has been drawn through a picture just like the Pevensey kids. That's interesting because he's clearly not a believer in Aslan, and not a believer in anything, actually. And in fact, he's entirely progressively educated, and he's opposed to everything they stand for, and yet he is also drawn by the power of whatever this magic is and pulled into this. So there's a sense of Lewis depicting God's grace drawing people even against their will. And that's interesting in terms of if we're applying a sort of a Christian way of looking at the novels, which I don't think is absolutely necessary to appreciate them, but I think it's useful, and the observations are obviously appropriate to explain why he does what he does. But that boy, Eustace, is drawn into the picture just like the rest of them, and as we saw at the outset, he's just a real royal pain, and he threatens to report them to the British consulate or this sort of stuff, and eventually finds himself wandering away, and he's a bad guy. I mean, he betrays the company, he's drinking their water, he wanders off, he's being selfish, and he is transformed into a dragon. So it's sort of a physical depiction, and it takes Aslan, not the company who has the Tau. Right? They're also believers in Aslan, all of them, right? In the name of Aslan, they all speak in such terms. But they also have in themselves the virtues that Lewis said would be the proper product of any education, whether Christian or classical. They would be seeking to give what historically would be called virtues, and they exemplify those virtues, and none more than actually the figure of Reepicheep, the little mouse. So he might be small in stature, but he's got a big chest in the sense of, the virtuous. He's not just a swordsman, but he's exemplary in his conduct and so forth, and his speech is very important to him. So it's really interesting. So they bring him on board, and they are influencing him in that sense, but their influence is insufficient to transform him. It's only when he meets Aslan, and Aslan speaks to him and tears the skin right off him, then he's born again. So it's all, but the church is not the vehicle for his transformation in the sense that they bring it about. It's Aslan himself who does it. Nonetheless, their company is an important part of it. So Lewis is saying something, if you want to take it theologically, about how the church functions and what the church does. And the church doesn't save anyone. In other words, Aslan does. So I said on the intro blurb to my YouTube take on this, that it's a sort of a Protestant equivalent of Dante and the Divine Comedy. So he's coming to faith through this, at least Eustace is. And it's, I think, quite useful. And then the end of it, obviously, they go to the ends of the earth, which in this case is a sort of a heaven, and we talked about that at some length, and I'm not going to repeat that. But the reason I'm talking about the Magician's Nephew, which is considered to be the first book in the series, although it wasn't the first book written, is because it really is, in terms of a historical development, it is the first, right? Because it gives the background. Frank and others who will meet only later on in the last battle we'll find these characters again, but they're present in this book, and then they disappear. And the Pevensey children are not important in this book, right? So, but we'll meet them again in the last battle. So this is sort of a prehistory. But in this, there's other issues here that are really important, and they're more important for C.S. Lewis personally, because the reflections of Diggory are very much like C.S. Lewis in terms of his biography and his loss of his mother. And it has an element of an autobiographical dimension there. And so there's that aspect, and I wanted to get into that a little bit. I don't want to make too much of what I don't like, which is people thinking that fiction is really just autobiography, people writing about their own experiences and just putting them in. I think that's a mode of reading that I disapprove of. But I do think the situation of a young boy whose mother is dying is clearly like that of Jack Lewis. And also it's reflecting on some very important things, and important for the things that I've just talked about on the course, namely the relationship of magic to power and different types of magic, because of course Narnia is a magical realm, and they're drawn there by the deep magic, right? So he's using the word magic, and in The Magician's Nephew, magic is one of the issues, but what sort of magic is it? It's a very ambiguous term, because the rings in the pocket are magical. They have power. But the magician, Uncle Andrew, doesn't really seem like much of a magician. He seems more like a scientist, and not a very good one at that, and probably of the sort that is described in The Abolition of Man. And he explains something of that. So that's what I wanted to get into. And in general, I want to argue, and he makes this case in a couple of places, one of them being his own personal sort of spiritual autobiography, Surprised by Joy. So he talks about the power of joy. And he doesn't, when he uses joy, he's not talking about a feeling of extreme happiness. It's that word, or that German phrase I used before, the selige Sehnsucht, the blessed desires which come from God. And that's what he's surprised by. The phrase surprised by joy, by the way, is a line from a poem by William Wordsworth. In fact, it's the name of the poem. And Lewis was a big fan of Wordsworth and read him very sympathetically, I think. He regarded him as one of his most important influences, because Wordsworth also sees a power in nature that's not natural. It's a supernatural power in nature, and of course that's very much in the vein of Lewis and Tolkien. I think they're probably doing different things there, and I argue that they do, but still there's something there that Lewis at least imaginatively finds helpful. And in general, throughout Narnia and throughout Lewis's whole corpus of work, what I think is going on is he is re-enchanting the cosmos, which was disenchanted by modern science. And when I say re-enchanting, I'm talking about restoring the Tao in a way that's sympathetic with both the classical age and the Christian age. And so we get all manner of classical figures appearing in Lewis's works, like even Father Christmas. But also we'll get Bacchus alongside of him, Bacchus who's the wine god, and also a god of poetry in ancient renderings, and also a god of ecstasy. And to some degree, so he uses Bacchus in a very positive way, but there's a very scandalous side to Bacchus, which is also there are orgies and massacres. Bacchus himself is torn apart and then brought back to life. So he's a sort of a Christ figure in some medieval Christian renderings. Bacchus himself is. And he sticks him right there alongside Father Christmas. Tolkien hated that. because he was mixing different strains and just throwing them all together, and there wasn't any sort of coherent rootedness in it. It was just throwing things together, and that was not Tolkien's practice, it was Lewis's. So he sticks elves alongside Bacchus, alongside Father Christmas, three things that are totally, in many ways, unrelated. And Tolkien found it aesthetically repugnant. But it's illustrating what both of them believe in, which is that there's a deep nature to nature which is irrepressible and needs to be acknowledged. And I'm not talking about Tolkien's work on this course particularly. I do that in the sci-fi subcreation course. But he does believe that there is a sort of magic to things that is still there. Now, it's not the magic that will convert you. That's Aslan's power. Not to be conflated with this magic, but still it's there. And in The Weight of Glory, if you want to read that, I don't know if I put it on the course as a reading, but I would recommend it. In The Weight of Glory, which was a sermon that he gave in Oxford, he talks about joy, which is the most piercing of all pleasures, and it's something that we long for. So he explains utopias, like in science fiction, and in all progressive views of life. The future towards which we're moving, which is infinitely superior to anything we've experienced in the past, and that's why it justifies what the progressive project and its effective refusal to acknowledge that it's actually destroying life because it's doing it for the greater good. It's because of this desire for a heaven. And he says the reason that we long for that is because that's what we're made for, and everyone recognizes that. But rather than seeking that, what God actually offers, we substitute a form of it ourselves. And when we do that, we do it through technology. We do it through our own power. So there's this dichotomy that gets set up between grace and power. There's a power being something that we control. So the Francis Bacon and using technology and science to gain power over nature. And that arises, if you recall, when we looked at the discarded image, he says it rises concurrently with modern science. It's very interesting. Magic is not really a part of medieval life. That's, the Enlightenment's take on it is that the medievalists were superstitious and prone to magic and so forth. Lewis, as a medievalist, says, I find no evidence of this, actually. I do find it, on the other hand, in the Renaissance period, which is allegedly now moving into rationality and trust in science and so forth. So it's very curious, he notes. And the reason, he says, is because magic is trying to gain power in the same way that Baconian science is also trying to gain power. So there's that, and the magician's nephew will show us how the magical rings are actually an implement for power the way the scientists use it, and Aslan, on the other hand, provides a different sort of magic. So it's either we control it, or if you want to put it in theological terms, do we save ourselves? Do we have power to save ourselves, or are we dependent on an external agent, totally helpless, can do nothing to save ourselves? That's the dichotomy he sets up there. And I'll look at the story and show how Diggory trusts in Aslan in the end and doesn't use the magical rings, even though they would get him what he wants, which is to save his mother. But he won't use them. And the reason he won't use them is because when he met Aslan, saw his enormous paws, I'll read the passage, he looked up in his face and he saw this enormous tear at his story and that what was happening to his mother. And that experience of Aslan's compassion is what he remembered when it came to, I have the means to save my mother now. And he doesn't do it, even though it's the thing he most wants in the world. He's going to trust. So that experience of Aslan transforms him, and he doesn't seek to control it, he gives himself over to it. So that is, and the reason that's important is because Lewis himself experienced this when he was a boy, when his mother Flora was dying, and he prayed. And he said it wasn't much of a prayer. And it wasn't even properly a prayer. It was, if I get myself into a prayer, I mean, to use the jargon these days, a prayerful posture, whatever the heck that means. What is a prayerful posture? I have no idea. Like what you see on a picture, that's a posture of prayer. I mean, prayer is an act. It's a calling upon the power of God to do what God does. But he understood it as you have to get yourself in a suitable frame of mind in order to, so prayer becomes like a form of magic. It's a sort of a power. The power of prayer, even hear people talk of the power of prayer as if prayer had any power, although it has none. When you see prayer as having power, you've misunderstood what prayer is. You're trying to control God then, right? And so he wants to distinguish that. And if you want to look at his reflections on prayer, you can go to that as well. I'm not going to deal with it on this course per se, but he talks about, I pray to God because I have no means of doing this myself. It's not me trying to say the right things to get God to do what I want. It's me calling out helplessly to God to do what I'm unable to do because I know him and I trust him. And so when he, is it The Problem of Pain? I'm trying to remember now. It might be another one. It might occur to me. He talks about the portrait of God as being like a lightning rod, a source of power, as a way of reflecting God's, enormous power, which he acknowledges. But he said the problem with that portrait is that a powerful lightning rod can only destroy me, and I can't appeal to a person there. That power is not ever going to answer me. I can't argue or appeal to a lightning rod. I can appeal to a person. So he dislikes all metaphors that suggest that God is a power without personhood. And a person then has a free will and also knows better than he, and that's why you go to God, because he is compassionate, he has power, and also it acknowledges your own frailty and your willingness to avoid all terms of coercion on your part. You're wholly placing yourself at God's mercy. Now, because he's free, he might not answer the prayer the way you want it to be answered. You might answer it a better way. You might seem not to answer at all. Now, he discusses this repeatedly. He also discusses that in the book that he wrote at the loss of his of Joy Davidman, A Grief Observed. That terrible sense that God is torturing us is sort of like a Job-like thing. But let me get to this now. But go back to what I said. I think he's describing the disenchantment of the world in the discarded image, and in his fiction, he's re-enchanting the world. And he's not doing it simply for the sake of storytelling. He's telling it because he thinks that's the way things really are. And that's why people like the fiction. It's not because it entertains them or diverts them or leads them to a reality that they can't experience. They think it is a better reflection of the way things are. That's why they like his fiction. So the image that was discarded is actually not, it hasn't been discarded because it's obsolete or redundant, or it is scientifically, but it's not on every other level. Now that's the problem that he faces, is that the science to some degree has broken that image, but on the other hand, our human nature needs that sense of purposiveness in all things and value in all things, and the idea that human judgments are consequential, and there are consequences for actions, not only in terms of what we do to other people, but how our own character is formed by the way we respond to not just stimuli, but moral situations. Will we lie when we're under pressure? Or will we tell the truth even though there's nothing in it for us? Those sorts of things. And he portrays them throughout his fiction. And these are illustrations of the Tao and its ongoing relevance. And that's why his stories are powerful and persuasive. But back to this, his mother was dying, and I think this was around the age of 9, I'm not 100% sure about this, but he says that when he was a child, he thought of God as a sort of a magician. It's interesting, the language. So a being who had the power to do miraculous things. And when you need a miracle, you pray to God. Now everybody, by the way, prays to God in this situation. Believer and unbeliever, they pray when they're at wit's end. I've yet to meet a person who doesn't do this. They probably exist, I'm sure that they do. But in general, my experience is that when people are in terrible trouble and they can't actually, nobody can solve it, at that point, and only then, they pray to God. Out of desperation, but not actually hope then. And sometimes God in His grace answers that. But that's not a prayer of faith, that's just a prayer of desperation. And the prayer of desperation is still holding on to the power of being able to orchestrate. So you're using prayer as a tool under your control to get the outcome you want. It's like an incantation. And when she died, he tried to convince himself that God would bring her back to life even. You can imagine the grief of a young boy. And he talked about how it affected his relationship with his father even, because his father was also grieving, and his father, I think, lost his father and even lost his brother within about a month. So you imagine his poor father, and his father's lost his mother and lost his wife rather, and the boys lost their mother, and their father didn't know how to cope with the two boys. Couldn't cope with his own grief, couldn't cope with his two boys, and he sent them off to boarding school, which he said is, which he depicts in all of his stories, these public schools. By the way, in Britain, a public school is the most private of the private schools. It's for the elite. Sent him to a very bad one. Lewis says nothing good about it. And he was effectively orphaned then. And that's also relevant here. And you will note throughout his works that all of the kids, even though they're not without parents, are effectively without parents because their parents have handed them over to other adults to bring them up. And in the progressive system, it ruins them. It means that they come to be without chests. But even in the case of like the Pevensies, they're with adults that are not their parents, and it has some effect. So they're in the orphan situation of being quasi-orphans. And that Lewis has in common with the fiction of the 19th and 20th centuries. And I find it always telling that now the church is the means of salvation, but not the family. That's interesting. And maybe troubling. And it's not a topic I'm going to explore too much on the course, but it's interesting that Lewis follows the pattern of the world that's departed from Christianity by to some degree ignoring the importance of the family, which is the first church, like Adam and Eve and their children. That's the first church that calls upon God's name and follows him, right? So that's just by the by. Very interesting thing to me, at any rate, because I've repeatedly noted this, the idea of the child, the orphaned child, as the hero of modern fiction, even in Lewis. So he, as I say, as a child, he prayed to God. God didn't answer his prayer, and you could think from this, well, what does a child conclude from that then? Because there's all sorts of possibilities there. But he saw it as a sort of a technique when he was a child. So as an adult, in analyzing himself as boy, he realized that he used prayer not prayerfully. He used prayer as a technique, as if God was a magician. And he wanted to control the magician through prayer. That's how he understood it. So it wasn't even a prayer. Now that's as a Christian looking back on it. If he weren't a Christian, he would not have attained that understanding of what he was doing. And so when he depicts it in his The Magician's Nephew, he's very careful in how he presents it and what he has Diggory do. Because many young children can't separate their desires from the idea that God is all-powerful and a judge. So maybe he would come out of that thinking that God was judging him or judging his mother. Right? All of these things are possible, and it would seem impossibly unfair. So at that point, the child who is desperate for compassion and an answer and gets nothing back sees a hostile God, right? Lacking in compassion. And so that moment when Aslan drops a tear for him, and that's the transformative thing, and I'll come to that passage, it's really important for Lewis in speaking to young Jack Lewis, who never encountered Aslan as a boy. And he's speaking to other people who've lost parents and so forth. And he's not just speaking to children. He's speaking to an adult audience. Adults enjoy these books as well and are moved by them deeply. So that's, but the contrast there between magic as a type of magic which is more akin to the grace of God, like the magic that pulls Eustace through the painting on the wall, or pulls the children through the wardrobe into Narnia, or pulls them along in the last battle while they're on a subway, that sort of thing, that power that comes not from them. Sometimes they call for it, and sometimes they are called for. And that's interesting. And the last one, they are called for. They're not praying about it. They just get summoned. Right? In the last battle, there's no prayer on their part. They don't want to be there. They are called for at that point. And that's interesting. So sometimes it's a response to our prayer, and sometimes it's a direct response to other people's prayers. Because remember, that's exactly what happens in the last battle. So Lewis thought there was nothing religious about his childhood prayers. And that's because he had come as a Christian to understand the distinction between prayer as a technique of coercion or exercising power over God to an appeal for an infinitely powerful God to show compassion because you already know who he is and know what he's like. So if you look at The Magician's Nephew, and he's writing, and by the way, in terms of chronology, about the same time he's writing Surprised by Joy. That's interesting as well. Just biography can sometimes be interesting. So if you look at the chronology, it's roughly around the same time. So I think he's reflecting on his own spiritual biography, as it were, and then thinking about Diggory and putting him then before the books about Narnia he's already written. And when we first meet this boy, and his name is Diggory Kirk, and it's interesting, his name's Kirk. Now it's Kirk with an E, but his beloved professor, Kirk, the great Knock, who taught him logic and logical thinking and was a confirmed atheist, nonetheless he said he owed so much to him because he was entirely rational about all things. And he appears in various places, here in the form of Diggory Kirk, I think, and then in another, in the sci-fi trilogy, he also appears in That Hideous Strength as the skeptic. Now, what's his name in That Hideous Strength? Just drawing a blank there. What's his name? Can't remember off the top of my head. It's a Scottish guy. Anyway, it will come to me. But Diggory is, Polly meets Diggory, and she meets him, and Polly is, this is back in the 19th century, because he says it's in those days back then when your grandfather was a child. He's writing in the 1940s. So when your grandfather was a child, back in the days when Sherlock Holmes was still living in Baker Street, so back in the 19th century, and the Bastables were looking for treasure in the Lewisham Road. In those days, if you were a boy, you had to wear a stiff Eton collar every day. So boys had a collared shirt, and they had to wear like a uniform, more or less. In those days, and there was a girl named Polly Plummer, and she met a boy, and the boy is crying. His name is Diggory, and Polly says it's a funny name. And his response, typical children, well, it's not half as funny as Polly. Polly's a fairly normal name in English, but this is children back and forth, and it's just insulting in response to a perceived insult. It's not half so funny as Polly. Yes, it is, said Polly. No, it isn't, said Diggory. At any rate, I do wash my face, said Polly, which is what you need to do, especially after. And then she stopped. She had been going to say, after you've been blubbing. Do you use the word blubbing? Okay. Blubbing, crying. My dad was born in Scotland, so I use certain vocabulary, and it's not always, doesn't translate always with blubbing. And she thought that wouldn't be polite, so she didn't say it. All right, I have then, said Diggory in a much louder voice, like a boy who was so miserable that he didn't care who knew he had been crying. Now at that point, a boy who doesn't care that he knows been crying is desperate, because boys never want to admit they've been crying, because it contradicts the Tao. Right? That's why. There's a moral reservation about it, particularly somebody brought up in Victorian Britain, where boys are to be like men and don't show their emotions, or at least don't show their weakness. But he's so miserable he doesn't care anymore. And he says, and so would you, he went on, if you'd lived all your life in the country and had a pony and a river at the bottom of the garden, and then been brought to live in a beastly hole like this. London isn't a hole, said Polly indignantly, but the boy was too wound up to take any notice of her, and he went on. And if your father was away in India, and you had come and lived with an aunt and an uncle who's mad, who wouldn't like that? And if the reason was that they were looking after your mother, and if your mother was ill and was going to die, then his face went the wrong sort of shape, as it does if you're trying to keep back your tears. I didn't know. I'm sorry, said Polly humbly. And then, because she hardly knew what to say, and also to turn Diggory's mind to cheerful subjects, he asked, is Mr. Kettery really mad? Either he's mad, said Diggory, or there's some other mystery. He has a study on the top floor, and Aunt Letty says I must never go up there. Well, that looks fishy to begin with. And then there's another thing. Whenever he tries to say anything to me at mealtimes, he never even tries to talk to her. She always shuts him up. She says, don't worry the boy, Andrew. Or, I'm sure Diggory doesn't want to hear about that. Or else, now, Diggory, wouldn't you like to go out and play in the garden? What sort of things does he try to say? I don't know. He never gets far enough. But there's more than that. One night, it was last night, in fact, as I was going past the foot of the attic stairs on my way to bed, and I don't much care for going past them either, I'm sure I heard a yell. Perhaps he keeps a mad wife shut up there. Yes, I've thought of that. In Jane Eyre, Mr. Rochester, right? So, or perhaps he's a coiner. Or he might have been a pirate. So now their imaginations are running wild with stories they've read or heard about, right? So they have a common ground in the sense that they both are interested in adventure, right? But the context here of Diggory's speech, note that father is in lowercase and mother is actually capitalized. I don't know if it's in your edition, but I think it is. So the extreme importance of the mother to Diggory, which was apparently also Jack Lewis's. He was more attached to his mother than his father. It's not unusual for boys, and vice versa. Often daughters to their father. Why it is, I don't know. It isn't a rule, but it's common. But note he doesn't pray for his mother's healing. This is the point I want to emphasize here. Unlike C.S. Lewis, when his mother Flora was dying, who prayed and didn't get an answer, Lewis decides not to have Diggory pray. And the reason he doesn't is because it would confuse matters at this point. He doesn't want to get there because his prayer wasn't he says as an adult, looking back on himself, his prayer was a fake prayer, or was an attempt to manipulate or gain power, like as in magic. And he's going to illustrate that in different ways. But he doesn't pray for his mother's healing. And what's also interesting here, and I think one of the reasons why you can read Lewis's Narnia stories without being a Christian or even thinking that Christianity is the main thing, is that the people in Narnia give little evidence of being Christians. Very little evidence. I mean, Christians, as I say, I told you I was asked to speak in a church about Lewis and the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and I insisted it was not a Christian allegory, and the pastor's wife was ready to lynch me because that's what I was supposed to say. And anyway, that's me being contrary, I guess, but I just couldn't. I'm not going to tell you what I'm pretty sure is not the case. It's not. He's not supposed to. It's not one for one. I mean, he insisted on himself. But look at this, the people in this story. So the cabbie in The Magician's Nephew becomes King Frank, but he is not what we would call a Christian. I mean, he had a Christian upbringing. So he sings a few hymns and so forth. Though he heard them as a boy. I mean, it's 19th century England. Everybody in 19th century England is in and around Christian stuff. So they would all go to church, more or less. Or at least it'd be very common, particularly among the working classes. They go to Sunday school. The Sunday school movement begins in that period. And children are sent to the Sunday schools by their parents on a Sunday. It's the one day that they're not working, because the children are also working at a certain age. And the parents send them there to get them out of the house, probably. And they go in their masses. So there are churches here in the city from that era that can accommodate something up to in the order of 500 children. And I'm told that they were once packed with children. So Knox Presbyterian, Jarvis Street Baptist, they have huge space for hundreds, and they used to bus them in from all over the city. Both churches. I'm sure it was the case for all the historic churches. And so when Frank sings his hymns, it's not because he's a Christian. It's more of his background. It's an old song that he knows. And then it's only in the last battle that you get direct, more or less, references to Christianity. More or less. Other than that, they're all at best allegorical, even though he'll dispute the use of the word allegory. But the indirect references are everywhere. Everywhere. And the reason he doesn't do it directly is because he, again, sees this great commonality. So the Tao, as he calls it, is actually fulfilled in Christ. Everything that's good, everything that's lovely, everything that's beautiful, everything that's joyful, which everybody experiences, whether they're Christian or not, actually finds its fulfillment in Christ. But he's trying to appeal in story, and stories do this best. They're appealing to, they're playing the tune on the keys that everybody possesses in their own breast and in their own heads, their own minds. And this is why he has such a popular appeal. Not just a favorite for Christian audiences, but many others, and Tolkien likewise. In Tolkien, there's not even a mention of God. Right? If you think of the Lord of the Rings, they don't even pray. Not even Gandalf. There's no prayer at all. So Diggory doesn't pray here, and at a certain point, he doesn't even seem to have any hope, which is also, when we meet him here, right at the outset, he's blubbing, and he's hopeless, not just helpless, but hopeless, and he's resolved, basically, that his mother is going to die. He takes it as a given. There's no way of rescuing her. He's not even willing to try prayer. But then, later on in the story, when he has traveled to the wood between the worlds, and to this world that once was and is now desolate. So Charn, where is this? The 3rd chapter. Now, remember, Uncle Andrew coerces them into taking the rings, tricks them in some ways. And they get there, and they get to this wood between the worlds at chapter 3. And rather than go into that, when he comes back, he hears his aunt saying that it would need fruit from the land of youth to help his mother now. He overhears that. So this is in the Bell and the Hammer, and he hears that, overhears that dialogue. And she also says, nothing in this world will do much. Now he's just been to another world after he's heard that. So now the embers of hope are starting to arise because, nothing in this world can save her. But there is a possibility in a fruit of the land of youth. That might be it. Well, he's just been in another world. Okay. So now the hope starts of a possibility at any rate arises in him. And then he goes on to think that perhaps there's one of these worlds that would have a fruit that could do this. And then he goes on and he says this. Well, you know how it feels when you begin hoping for something that you want desperately badly. You almost fight against the hope because it's too good to be true. You've been disappointed so often before. And so you're almost arguing against yourself and just the willingness to entertain a hope, because to be hopeful and to have your hopes dashed is worse than having no hope at all. Or at least that's so the belief. I mean, if you thought there was a smidgen of a possibility of real hope that it might be realized, then you'd be willing. But if it's just a fool's hope, as it were, like fool's false gold, then fine. But that's how Diggory felt. But it was no good trying to throttle this hope. It might, really, it just might be true. So many odd things had happened already. And he had the magic rings in his pocket, remember? There must be worlds you could get to through every pool in the wood. He could hunt through them all. And then mother well again. Everything right again. So now the attraction of the rings in his pockets, and if you want to see a parallel, which you probably ought to, between the rings in the Lord of the Rings and the rings that are in Diggory's pocket, it's here. The ring of power, it's irresistible. It'll allow him to do something that he cannot do, and it will fulfill all of his desires. And what's his desire here? It's power. Power to heal his mother. He means something good by it, but it's still power. It's power that he will control. Now, I'd say go back to C.S. Lewis's boyhood. Lewis had not visited another world. Diggory has. So there's divergence there. And he's been given no certainty of the power of the rings to do this. But on the other hand, he's been given a glimpse that it might be possible, because if they can take him to another world, and there are other worlds through different pawns in that world, then there might just be a place where that would be, and it will be through technology, because that's what this is. It's a thing forged with certain power attached to it. And now go back and think about what Lewis said in The Abolition of Man, in the 3rd chapter of The Abolition of Man, about the scientists and the power. And the scientists wearing their white lab coats, which are the equivalent of magicians' robes. And they say, well, we do science, right? You put on a white lab coat, now you're doing science, whatever doing science means. Since science means knowledge, you're doing magic. And I mean, it's fun wearing a lab coat, I guess. Sure. It's not just protecting your clothes, now you're wearing the garb. But he has that hope there, and he's hopeful that that the rings in his pocket can take him to the place where he'll find the fruit which he can bring back to heal his mother. But he doesn't touch the ring. He doesn't do this. Why? Why? Do you remember the story? If you don't, I'll go into it and not take up class time. Do you remember why he doesn't do it? Because at this point, it would seem the obvious thing to do. The thing he wants most in the world is his mother to be well. He has rings in his pockets which have already given him access to another world, and there are pawns in that world that he's not yet explored that might contain those trees. So the immediate thing to do would be to try it out. But he doesn't. Why doesn't he do it? You remember? You might not. No one? Okay. He promised to Aslan that he'd bring the fruit back. He was met Aslan, remember? And he promised he'd bring the fruit back to Aslan. That's his promise. And he knows that his mother would want him to keep a promise. And that's really interesting. He loves his mother, and he loves his mother enough that even if it's going to cost her his life, he's going to obey her rather than do what he wishes. That's key, right? And we'll see that instance arising in Lewis's Perelandra as well. The importance of keeping your word. And if you made a promise, you're going to stand by that. He sees fidelity, and promises, of course, are a sign of personal fidelity. And of course, God never lies, and he always keeps his promises. So his mother's conveyed the importance. You've promised, you have to do what you've promised. So don't just promise willy-nilly, and don't think that crossing your fingers behind your back is going to absolve the promise or abrogate the promise that's just been made. And you don't need to do a pinky swear or whatever my kids do now in school. But if you pinky swore, or you do a double dog dare or whatever, all the extra sauces that you pour on top to make the promise more effective, whatever. But he's promised that to Aslan he's going to give the ring back, and his mother would want him to do what he said he was going to do. So two things, Aslan and his mother. So it shows that he really loves his mother. His mother's not there for selfish reasons only. He actually genuinely loves his mother, and he honors her by wanting to do what she wants him to do. Second point, the witch tries to convince him to bring the rings back, bring the fruit to his mother. So two, contrary. Aslan wants him to bring the fruit back to him. The witch wants him to bring the fruit to his mother, rather than Aslan, which would mean, by the way, if you recall, that his mother, that Polly would be left behind. And that would be a beastly thing to do. And he says at that point, what the witch said was not, he realized, and in the direct phrase, all the other words that the witch had been saying to him sounded false and hollow. Why? Why, to little Diggory, who's not a Christian, would the witch's direction, take the fruit to your mother, which means leaving Polly behind, why would it sound him false and hollow? Those two words. Why? What is it that Lewis is saying about Diggory there? He's a chest, correct. He knows it's wrong. And if the witch is telling him to do that, then what she's saying must also be wrong and is leading him down a errant path. He's not going to do it. He made a promise, there's the positive inducement, but he was also told to do a bad thing by the witch. And even though there is a good outcome to it as far as he can tell, a bad means to get a good outcome he's not going to accept. And he doesn't. And so he does what he was told. He brings the fruit back to Aslan. And it's a terrible choice. And it actually says he wasn't even sure all the times that he'd done the right things. And that's also telling. There's no immediate reward for it. He's not even sure, because he thinks how desperately he wants his mother well. And he's done it because it's right. For all the right reasons. He's avoided doing a bad thing. He's done a good thing. But he's bringing it to Aslan. He's not bringing it to his mother, and the fruit's going to heal his mother. So he's unsure because he hasn't yet seen the full consequence of his actions. But what does reassure him, and this is the passage I was talking about, is the memory of his first conversation with Aslan when he talked about his mother. And the memory is this. He says this, and he's pleading for his mother's life. Please, please, won't you? Can't you give me something that will cure mother? Up till then, the narrator takes over. He'd been looking at the lion's great front feet and the huge claws on them. Now, in his despair, by the way, the word despair, Lewis is a Latin, scholar, so despero means he has no hope. Spero in Latin, S-P-E-R-O, is I hope. In despair, you're void of hope. He has no hope. He looks up to the face in despair, not out of hope, He's not hoping. He looks up in despair. So it's not his feelings that have led him towards what he will see. It's actually there's nothing in him that is going to allow him, but it's the face of Aslan that looks back at him. What he saw surprised him as much as anything in his whole life. For the tawny face was bent down near his own, and wonder of wonders, great, shining tears stood in the lion's eyes. They were such big, bright tears compared with Diggory's own that for a moment he felt as though the lion must really be sorrier about his mother than he was himself. And that is the thing that finally convinced him that he did the right thing. That Aslan's compassion, manifest compassion, greater compassion, is more compassion, if anything, than Diggory himself. And that's what persuades him. It's the compassion of Aslan, who is a sort of a, say Christians will see as a Christ figure. It's the compassion of Christ. It's the willingness to lay down his life. All those are what draw him. It moves him to do the right thing as well. And then he accepts that what Aslan must be true. Not only because he gave his promise, not only because betraying Polly would be a bad thing, but because he is convinced, because he knows the character of the one who he promised it to. That's what pushes him. And he accepts the statement Aslan made, and this is an interesting statement. Aslan said that someday both of them would have looked back if he'd given, and he says, if you've given your mother this fruit, if you'd done what the witch had said, one day you would have looked back and said it would have been better to die in that illness than to have given it to her. Because so Aslan confirms the fruit would actually heal her. She would have been given magically, in some ways, her life back. But you would have bitterly regretted it, because she would die again, and there would have been a spiritual consequence for both of you. That's interesting. So it's not just what you do and how you do it, but why you do it that matters. Diggory has to give up all hopes of saving his mother's life, and he really believes that the lion knew that there might be things even more terrible than losing somebody you love by death. There might be things even worse. He trusts the lion that this is so. So the choice is there. And the choice is between magic and faith. The magic will compel. It will create an outcome. Go back to the Abolition of Man, the use of technology to gain control over human nature will create a certain outcome. And the outcome will be that life will be extended. But will it be enriched or will it be impoverished? To use Tolkien's phrase of Bilbo Baggins, he's put on the ring, right? And he feels like he's butter, like his life is like butter spread over too much bread. There's a thinness. He's lost some of the spice of life, the virtue of living, but he's lived longer. Remember we talked about in the discarded image, the longevity, the long-lived ones, but they live in accordance with the Tao. This is a different sort of thing. This is the mere extension of life. And it begs the question of, well, what is life? And it's not just biological existence. That's a consecutive sort of thing. That's not to be conflated with eternal life. Eternal life is not one day and then the next day, and that's perpetuity. That's not eternity. This is perpetuity. Powers over perpetuity, and even the perpetuity doesn't end, because one day his mother will die and so will he. And the fact that he disobeyed Aslan and the fact that she had no faith will land her in a terrible place. So he's right? You see the contrast he's presenting here right in this story? So there's the power of magic, and the magic is there in the fruit, and it's there in the ring, and through both the use of both of them, he could have given his mother life, but he didn't. And Aslan actually does say it will work. It's just not going to work the way you expect. So comment on modern science. It does work. It does produce results. You can market them. You can commodify them. You can sell them. People will want the next elixir that will allow their life to be extended. But it still begs the question of what are you actually extending? And you can extend your physical, biological life, but you cannot extend your moral nature. You can only do that through obedience to the Tao, and obedience above all to God who created the Tao. And that only comes by faith and not by magic. The time of the arising of magic is the Renaissance, at the time of modern science. And that's the beginning of the decline of faith. Got nothing to do with the Reformation, by the way. Other than the fact that, interestingly, most of the scientists were actually in England, the Royal Society. Is there something problematic about even the power of nature? Power over nature? I don't think so per se. It's what you intend by that and what you use it. But the science itself is not a bad thing. It was, in many cases, done by men and women who were trying to honor God and trying to use what knowledge had always been used for, which is to undo the consequences of the fall. Not just in terms of a spiritual life with Christ, but in terms of exercising dominion over the earth under God's holy law. Right? They're trying to the thorns and the thistles are being turned back, beaten into plowshares, etc. Right? So they're using that. Now again, once you've created the thing, it can be used in a good way or in a bad way, and it's usually used in a bad way because of sin. But it doesn't need to be so. Anyway, but he says that mere biological life is not all we want. We want love. We want love, and love cannot be coerced. It can't be manipulated. It can't be controlled. Diggory wants his mother's love. And he can't have his mother's love if he ignores his mother's character. And his mother's character is reflected in what he sees in Aslan. Because all love is connected in that chain. And we'll look at that when we look at the four loves, where it talks about four different types of love. The storge and the eros and the philia and the agape love, yeah. These are all different types of love, but they are not disconnected. They're species of them, and it applied in different ways. But when he has faith in them, in Aslan, it is because of the tears. I think it's really key. And then he decides that he's going to lay aside the power of magic, which is right in front of him and is obviously real, and in preference to the life of faith. So that's a key moment, I think. And at that point, when he gives up all hope, his hope is given back to him. Only at that point, when he's given up all hope of his mother's restoration, Aslan gives it back to him. So the apple, which he didn't give to him, he gives him another apple, Aslan. And this apple then heals his mother. First apple he didn't get to use. Second one, there you go. Now this is what God wouldn't give Jack Lewis when he was a boy, Jaxie. Didn't get that. But in Lewis's understanding, and I think the story's making it clear, in this world, everything that we see, everything that we love is taken away from us. Everyone and everything. Ultimately, it's taken away. Your mother, your father, your child, your spouse, your grandparents, whatever. Everything's taken away. Your job, your health, your sanity, all these things are taken away. from you. What he's talking about is a restoration that comes after that to those who live by faith. If they live by faith now, they will live by faith then, because life there is lived by faith, and so it must be lived by faith here, and that's the message then. And we will always, the ones that we love, which are taken away from us, we can't see them anymore, and yet they still motivate us, that love for them. And that love is connected to the love. Anyway, this is a quote, and it's a fantastic one. It's from, I mentioned this biography already, and I really like it. And I just think the Narnian, by Alan Jacobs. He's got this terrific instance from Flora Lewis's calendar. And it had a daily quotation from Shakespeare. So you've got those sorts of things yourself, a daily quotation. And the lines on the day of her death offered this speech from King Lear. Men must endure their going hence, even as their coming hither, ripeness is all. Now, you say, so what? The family preserved that page from the calendar as a memorial to the woman whom Albert, that is her husband, called as good a woman, wife, and mother as God has ever given to man. 55 years later, I'm reading here, Warney would have those first 6 words, men must endure their going hence, inscribed on his brother's grave. So it's on Jack Lewis's grave. The words that were on his mother's calendar is inscribed on his. And men must endure their going hence. He has to endure his brother's going hence. So he's read his brother's books. Warney, if you know anything about him, had a problem with alcohol. Broken-hearted, just like Jack Lewis was. Maybe never got over it in the same way. I don't know the specifics there of his own situation, but it's telling that that was the epitaph on Jack Lewis's grave, was the very thing that was circled on his mother's calendar 55 years ago, words from Shakespeare that applied to death and the departure of loved ones. Let's go back to the magic. So that's the role of faith versus magic. Let's look a bit at the magic. Let's look at the figure of Uncle Andrew. Because he is the magician, of course, and the nephew is Diggory. But he is actually the magician, but he's not much of a magician. He's a bit of a buffoon, actually. More of a mad scientist. So he's inherited rings with magical powers. He didn't invent them even. He's just found them. And he knows a bit of the history of magic. So he's not much of a scientist then. He's a sort of a quack. He's an alchemist. He's a sort that we meet actually in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Their early dabblings in alchemy and trust in the magical power of science. And that's what motivates even Victor Frankenstein, actually. It's all about power. That's what he wants. He wants power. And so does Uncle Andrew. And more so perhaps because he is so pathetic as an individual. But he calls his work with rings experiments, and he's going to test his ideas, so he sounds like a scientist, right? So he uses scientific jargon, but he's appealing to magic, which is contrary to science, as it's properly understood, as Lewis understood it. And even as guinea pigs, which is Lewis, we use in the English language, people being guinea pigs. He literally has guinea pigs, and he uses them and he sends them into the other worlds, and of course in that world within the world, they find the guinea pigs there. They're not coming back. And that's why he sends them there. Note that he won't even go himself. If he's a real scientist, he would have gone himself. But he's willing to do, and that illustration of what he said in the Abolition of Man, the conditioners will try on you what they would never do to themselves. So Uncle Andrew is a coward. Let's see what happens to these children that are under my power. And if it works for them, then I might utilize it. But if it goes wrong, well, that's just the cost of doing what I do, which is advancing science. So he's the mad scientist, and he is the one who's, the title, the magician's nephew. But there is a real magician, and that's Jadis. Now, Jadis is an empress, and she is a sort of she's not the White Witch. She's an earlier form of the same spiritual power. I don't think she's Satan, in case we're wondering there. She's a woman, for one thing. She's an enormous woman, and she does genuinely have power. And they come, Diggory and Polly, accidentally, she grabs onto them as they're leaving, going back to the world, and she comes back with them. And when Uncle Andrew meets Jadis, he's totally infatuated with her. She's about 7 feet tall and beautiful. Okay, that's one. But also she has power, and she's wondering if he's a real magician. Like, who called me here? And then when she meets him, it's like, this is no magician. She immediately recognizes what he is. He's neither a magician nor is he a scientist. He's a pathetic old man. But what he loves about is her will to power. She wants to control everything. And she has something of that power. And she is going to rule the world with that power or destroy it. And that's the alternative. Either it's her way or total destruction, which is what she did in her own world, Charn. And she used that. What's the word called? The what word? Deplorable word. Just took me a sec. The power of the deplorable. What is the deplorable? Well, who knows? If you say it, it's cause. And she knew the power of the deplorable word, and that power, that incantation, destroyed all. And it destroyed all in the sense it destroyed everything that she loved as well. So for the sake of power, she was willing to sacrifice everything. So that marked her character. This is demonic. Satanic, the desire for power and lust, even over everything that you love. For the sake of love, you want it, and on the other hand, you're willing to sacrifice love. So she's the antithesis to Diggory in that sense. When Uncle Andrew is brought in Narnia and the moment of its creation, this is really interesting. So if you recall, in The Magician's Nephew, Narnia does not yet exist. We're going to see it brought into creation, and it's brought into creation by the words of Aslan, or it's a lion at any rate. It has to be Aslan. And the words of Aslan are actually a song. He's singing the world into creation. Not just speaking it, but singing it. Now, this probably fits with the early church fathers' sense that song is prayer twice over. If you want to pray well, then sing it as well. Because when you're singing, there's the harmony and the beauty that goes with it, which is something, a reflection of God's own language, the language of music. By the way, in the early church, they didn't have unaccompanied music. They didn't play instruments. They only had the human voice. They used words. Instruments are added later. I won't get into that issue here. But when he sees the lion singing, everyone else is entranced by the singing. What does he hear? He can't hear the singing. What does he hear? Roaring, terrified by what is a good thing. What does it reflect on him? Like, this is real power he's experiencing there. It's creating everything out of nothing through the song of the lion. And yet, in experiencing that power, he is powerless, and so he's not interested in that. And in fact, he sees it as hostile towards him, and it is hostile towards him insofar as he is only interested in power for its own sake and not power for the sake of the one who is powerful. So again, it's a comment on modern science and its motivation. The motivation is not there of benevolence, it's of libido dominandi, the lust for power, the power of dominating all life, just like Sauron with his ring. Right, the one ring that Sauron had, and so did Melkor. Again, power. And if you go to Tolkien's Silmarillion, Iluvatar also sings the nation, and Melkor introduces a note of discord into the song. So it's a sort of a account of the fall of sorts. Melkor being not a god, but a sort of a powerful being. There's a sort of a rebellion. And discord is introduced at that point. I think that's really interesting. And we're told at the end of that passage I talked with Uncle Andrew, when at last the lion spoke and said, "Narnia, awake," he didn't even hear those words. He didn't hear. He only heard a snarl. And Lewis's comment is, soon he couldn't have heard anything else, even if he'd wanted to. All he could hear is snarling, wrath towards him, because he wouldn't listen to the song as a song. He heard no music, and it was discord. There's a passage in Paul where he talks about, for those who have faith, that the message of Christ is like the sweet smell of heaven, whereas for those who are perishing, it's like the stench of death. That's what I think Lewis is on here. It's the same song. It's perceived differently because the motivations are different and the allegiances are different. And you can see the same thing in by the way the last battle, the way the dwarves respond to Aslan, right? They can't hear, all they hear is roaring. Same sort of passage. I won't go through that here, but I think that's talking about something similar there. But I think that's interesting. The final thing I want to say is that Uncle Andrew knows enough of the Tao to use it to motivate Diggory early on. It's not that he has no chest himself. This is the problem here. He's not from the progressive school system. He's just a bad man. He knew enough of the Tao to use the Tao to persuade Diggory to do what he wanted him to do. So when Diggory won't put on the magic ring and go in search of Polly, who Uncle Andrew's made disappear, Uncle Andrew says he would be disappointed if the boy showed the white feather. Now, the white feather is a sign of treachery, cowardice. It was given to people who wouldn't go to war in World War I. Or is it II? I think it's World War I. The white feather. Right? Don't be a coward. He's appealing to standards of bravery. And of course, he responds to him saying, well, why don't you go? Why aren't you, like, tit for tat? Of course. Well, why aren't you a coward? And his response is, and that Diggory points out, you broke your promise to your dying godmother. Uncle Andrew replies, oh, I see, you mean that little boys ought to keep their promises. Very true. Speaking of himself, very true, I ought to have. Most right and proper, I'm sure, and I'm very glad you've been taught to do it. But of course, you must understand that rules of that sort, however excellent they may be for little boys and servants and women, and even people in general, can't possibly be expected to apply to profound students and great thinkers and sages. No, Diggory, men like me who possess hidden wisdom are freed from common rules. Just as we are cut off from common pleasures, ours, my boy, is a high and lonely destiny. And Diggory translates this and says all that means is that he thinks he can do anything he likes to get anything he wants, which is correct. That's the commentary. The boy gets it, and now all children get it. So the rules don't apply means this is a bad man. And Lewis is saying that is what those who break the Tao are suggesting. Again, so I'll leave it at that. Connected it with Lewis's own personal biography, and we didn't bring it up to his conversion story and all that, but I can do that maybe the next class when we talk about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which I won't be so perverse as not to discuss. since everyone wants to hear that as well. So we'll look at that next time, but next time midterm, and I'll see you then. And then I believe we have a reading week. Is it all right? Yeah. So we'll pick it up on Monday, and we'll look at The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and we'll see if we can pull in other themes and so forth. But then last ones, we'll look at the Silver Chair and the Last Battle. And I'll have to avoid A Horse and His Boy, which I dearly love. Or I'll bring it in maybe with the Last Battle and talk about it, because there's some commonality there. But